Morning came slowly to the camp, as if the sun itself hesitated before crossing the quiet fields of northern England. A pale light seeped across the wooden barracks, touching the frost that clung to the wire fences and the damp earth beneath them. Nothing moved at first. Only the faint rustle of canvas roofs settling in the cold breeze suggested that life was waking. Inside the compound, rows of huts stood still, their shapes softened by mist, their silence broken only by the distant call of a kettle rattling on a stove. It was a place built for confinement, yet in these early moments it felt strangely suspended, caught somewhere between war and a reluctant peace. The British guards moved slowly, their boots pressing into the softened ground, each step measured rather than harsh. They had learned the rhythm of this place, a rhythm not of battle, but of routine. The crackle of boots on gravel, the muted exchange of morning greetings, the metallic click of the gate, these were the sounds that shaped each day. Inside the wire, German prisoners stepped out one by one, shoulders stiff from sleep, eyes adjusting to the gentle gray. They carried the weight of a world they no longer controlled, yet their expressions softened as the cold air filled their lungs. The camp was not warm, nor was it welcoming, but it had a stillness that held them, a strange quiet that offered space to breathe. And in that breath, something faint but unmistakably human began to stir, drawing the day gently forward. Many of the German prisoners had arrived with their nerves drawn tight, braced for the kind of hostility they had been taught to expect. On the journey across the Channel, packed shoulder to shoulder in the dim hold of a transport ship, they whispered to one another about what awaited them. Some imagined harsh beatings, others spoke of cold cages or endless interrogations. The war had filled their minds with images of the British as stern, unyielding figures, men who would look at them not as soldiers, but as enemies to be punished. Those thoughts clung to them even as they stepped onto English soil, their boots hitting ground they had only known through warnings and rumors. Yet as they entered the camp, something felt out of place. The guards did not shout or shove them. The orders were firm, but spoken without malice. A few prisoners noticed the quiet way the guards watched them, not with hatred, but with a kind of weary acceptance, as if they too were simply caught in the machinery of war. This unexpected gentleness unsettled the men more than anger would have. It softened the edges of their fear, leaving them unsure of what this new captivity would truly mean. And so they waited, uncertain, but quietly listening within. What struck the prisoners first was the way the British guards carried themselves, not with the swagger of victors, nor the cold authority they had braced for, but with a kind of steady calm. These were men who moved through their duties with quiet discipline, their gestures measured, their voices low. When they spoke to the captives, it was rarely with sharpness. Instructions were offered clearly, almost politely, as though they were guiding newcomers rather than overseeing defeated soldiers. Some guards even nodded in greeting, a small gesture that felt disarming in its simplicity. The prisoners exchanged glances, unsure how to read this unexpected civility. One young guard, barely older than the prisoners he watched, adjusted a man's coat that had slipped from his shoulders, doing it so naturally that the gesture lingered in the air. Another paused to let a limping captive catch up before closing a gate. These were small moments, almost forgettable on their own, but together they unsettled the hardened expectations the prisoners carried within them. It was not kindness exactly, but something quieter, an understanding born from shared exhaustion. And as the Germans observed these details, subtle yet persistent, they felt a faint shift inside, a soft curiosity beginning to take root.
They came from different corners of Germany, yet in the camp they shared the same quiet fears that settled over them like a second uniform. Some had been farmers, their hands more familiar with soil than rifles. Others were clerks or apprentices who had left behind half-finished lives, expecting to return within months. Now each man carried a private weight that he rarely voiced. At night, when the barracks dimmed and the wooden walls creaked with the cold, thoughts drifted back to kitchens left empty, fields unattended, and families waiting without knowing where their sons had been taken. Many worried not for themselves, but for the letters that might never reach home, the news that might travel more slowly than hope could endure. They replayed the last moments before capture, wondering if they had failed or if there had ever been another path. In the daylight, they tried to hide these thoughts behind stoic faces, yet the truth lived in small gestures, the way one man lingered by the fence to feel the wind from the east, or how another tucked a worn photograph inside his jacket as if it could warm him. Beneath the surface of their rigid training, they were simply men trying to hold on to fragments of identity in a place filled with uncertainty. And in those unspoken moments, their humanity revealed itself softly, drawing them closer to the quiet understanding they would soon share.
The British Guards, too, carried their own stories beneath the weight of their uniforms. Most were not hardened warriors, but men who had once worked in shops, fields, or workshops before being called into service. Some had left families behind in small villages only a few miles from the very camps they now patrolled. They woke each morning with stiff backs and the memory of better routines, children's laughter at breakfast, the rhythm of a familiar job, the quiet comfort of knowing what each day would bring. War had taken that certainty from them long before these prisoners arrived. Many of the guards were older than the Germans they watched over, their faces lined not by battle, but by sleepless nights and the strain of too much responsibility. They worried about rationing, about wives managing households alone, about sons who might soon be drafted themselves. In small moments between duties, they sipped weak tea and spoke softly of home, their voices carrying a tired affection. When they looked at the prisoners, it was not with triumph, but with the recognition of men caught in the same wide net of circumstance. They understood that the uniforms on the other side of the fence hid fears and memories much like their own, and in that recognition, the harsh labels of enemy and captive began to ease, making room for something quieter and more human to take shape.
It began almost without intention, in the unremarkable moments that often carry the greatest shifts. One morning, as prisoners lined up for their rations, a guard pointed to a stack of crates and said the word bread in a slow, careful tone. A few Germans exchanged puzzled looks until one of them, a former schoolteacher, repeated the word back with a hesitant accent. The guard nodded, slightly amused, and repeated it again, tapping the crate with 2 fingers. There was no lesson planned, no formal gesture, just a simple attempt to bridge a small gap of understanding. Later, another guard gestured toward the water pump and mouthed the word wash, exaggerating the shape of his lips until a few of the younger prisoners laughed quietly and tried to mimic him. The moments were small and easy to dismiss, yet they gathered quietly in the background of camp life. A guard would hand someone a tool and offer its English name, or pause before an order to break it down into simpler words. The prisoners, surprised by the lack of mockery or impatience, found themselves leaning in, curious despite their caution. These exchanges were tentative, almost fragile, but they hinted at something beyond routine, a faint suggestion that even here, behind wire and watchtowers, 2 worlds might inch toward understanding.
It happened on a gray afternoon, when time in the camp felt especially slow, the kind of day when the clouds hung low enough to blur the edge of the hills. A small group of prisoners had gathered near one of the outer sheds, repairing tools under the supervision of a middle-aged guard named Thompson. He was a quiet man, known for speaking only when necessary, yet something shifted in him that day. Watching the men struggle with the broken hinge, he tapped the metal with his knuckles and said, "Hinge," shaping the word clearly, as if offering it rather than instructing. The prisoners paused, unsure whether to repeat it or ignore it. After a moment, one of them tried the word, stumbling slightly over the unfamiliar sound. Thompson corrected him gently, and the effort drew a faint smile across his normally stiff face. That small exchange opened a door neither side had expected. Soon he was pointing to other objects, a hammer, a nail, a plank, and naming each one with slow patience. The men followed, their voices uneven but earnest. There was no mockery, no sense of superiority, only an unexpected willingness to meet somewhere in the middle. For the prisoners, the moment felt strangely comforting, as if someone had reached through the fog of war to remind them that a language could be shared instead of feared. And, for the first time, they felt a quiet trust begin to take root, soft but unmistakable, like the first warmth of spring pressing through cold soil.
The prisoners had never imagined that their captors would spend even a moment easing the weight of their captivity, and so the simple act of hearing an English word repeated with patience left many of them quietly stunned. They carried their disbelief silently, almost afraid to acknowledge it aloud, as though naming it might cause the moment to vanish. These were men who had braced themselves for cruelty, for sharp orders and colder silences. Instead, they found themselves standing in a loose semicircle around a British guard who corrected their pronunciation with the calm focus of a village schoolmaster. Some of the younger prisoners watched with wide eyes, their brows furrowed not in fear, but in a kind of tender confusion. Others, older and more cautious, held back slightly, listening without stepping forward, their skepticism slowly softening. Each repeated word felt like a tiny release, a subtle easing of the tension that had lived in their shoulders since the day of their capture. There was relief in discovering that the world on this side of the barbed wire was not built entirely from hostility. No man said it outright, yet the change flickered visibly in the way they stood, in the way their breath eased and their gazes lifted from the ground. It was not trust, not yet, but it was something close, a fragile hope that perhaps the rules of war did not fully define the space they now lived in.
What surprised both sides most were the small, almost playful moments that crept into the lessons. One afternoon, a young prisoner attempted to pronounce the word thistle, only to twist his tongue so completely that even Thompson couldn't keep a straight face. The guard pressed a hand to his mouth, trying to stifle a laugh, and the prisoner, after a heartbeat of uncertainty, let out a quiet chuckle of his own. The sound rippled through the group, soft and hesitant at first, then warming into genuine amusement. For a few seconds, it felt as if the war had loosened its grip, allowing something simple and human to slip through. Another time, a guard exaggerated the roundness of an English O, making his face comically expressive until the men standing nearest mimicked him, each one more dramatic than the last. Their shared laughter was gentle, almost shy, but it carried a warmth neither side had expected to feel here. Even those who stood at a distance found themselves smiling without meaning to, surprised by how natural it felt. These moments did not erase the fence or the uniforms, but they softened the lines between them, creating a space where two groups of weary men could meet without fear. And in that softened space, the beginnings of understanding quietly took root, steady as breath and just as life-giving.
In the background of these quiet exchanges lay a practical truth that shaped the way the guards approached their prisoners. Britain, worn thin by years of conflict, was already thinking about the weight of rebuilding that would follow once the fighting stopped. Entire towns had lost working men to the front, and industries that once thrived now struggled under shortages of labor and materials. Farms lacked hands to bring in harvests, railways ran with fewer crews, and factories strained to meet even the simplest demands of daily life. The war had consumed not only lives, but the rhythm of ordinary work, leaving gaps that would stretch long into the peace that everyone hoped was coming. For the guards, this reality was never far from mind. Many of them had family members back home juggling too much, fields to tend, shops to manage, repairs that could no longer be postponed. They knew that once the guns fell silent, the country would need workers, steady hands willing to rebuild what had been worn down. Teaching a few words of English to the prisoners was not part of any formal plan, yet it aligned naturally with these unspoken concerns. If these men, now living behind wire, could one day help fill the spaces left empty by war, then every small lesson carried its own quiet purpose. The practicality of it blended with something more human, reminding everyone that the world beyond the fence still needed healing, and that even in captivity, a future could be prepared in small, steady steps.
For the German prisoners, the idea that these simple lessons might hold value beyond the camp came slowly, like a distant sound carried on a changing wind. At first, they treated the words as curiosities, strange shapes of the mouth, nothing more. But over time, as they repeated them during work details or in the soft murmur of evening, a new thought began to settle in. If the war truly ended soon, what would they return to? Many imagined towns scarred by conflict, jobs swept away, and a nation struggling to stand. The future felt uncertain, and uncertainty carried its own quiet fear. Yet the English words, small, practical, and easy to grasp, offered a sliver of direction, something tangible in a world that no longer felt familiar. Some men spoke softly in the barracks at night, wondering if knowing even a little English might help them find work when the world rearranged itself again. A few imagined crossing borders to rebuild railways or repairing machines in places that once felt impossibly distant. They did not dream boldly. The war had taught them caution, but they allowed themselves to think, just for a moment, that these lessons could become stepping stones rather than distractions. The thought did not erase their fears, but it brought a gentle, steadying sense of possibility, like seeing a faint light where they had expected only darkness. In time, the lessons grew into something more than scattered words traded over daily tasks. They became a quiet bridge, a subtle thread connecting the prisoners' present confinement to a future that no longer seemed entirely unreachable. Language, once a barrier that marked them as outsiders, slowly shifted into a tool, simple, practical, and unexpectedly hopeful. A guard would gesture toward a broken tool and name its parts, and suddenly the men were not just repairing something for the day, but learning the vocabulary of work that might one day matter again. A prisoner practicing the word timber while stacking planks felt, for a brief moment, as if he were rehearsing for a life beyond the wire, rather than simply passing time inside it. Even the older men, who had first resisted the lessons, found themselves repeating words under their breath, tasting the unfamiliar syllables with quiet determination. They understood that the world awaiting them would be changed, and that they would need to change with it. English, they realized, was not merely the language of their captors, but a key, one that might open doors to rebuilding, cooperation, or simply survival in whatever lay ahead. The lessons did not erase the hardships surrounding them, but they softened the harshness with a sense of preparation, a small reassurance that when the war's shadow finally lifted, they would not walk into the unknown empty-handed. Daily life in the camp began to shift in ways so subtle that most men didn't notice the change until it had already taken root. What had once been a rigid sequence of chores, lining up for rations, repairing tools, tending small patches of ground,
slowly adopted a new rhythm shaped by the steady exchange of words. In the mornings, as steam rose from the kitchen shed and the guards handed out portions of bread and porridge, a few English terms would drift through the air, carried on quiet voices practicing their newest phrases. A man might murmur "thank you" under his breath before he felt confident enough to say it aloud. Another would point at a pot or a ladle, searching for the right English word, while his companion tried to help. The guards noticed, and without fanfare, they began offering new words in return, their tone gentle, their instructions woven into the ordinary sounds of work. During repairs, the rhythm of hammers and saws blended with softly repeated vocabulary, turning each task into something almost meditative. Even the long walks to fetch supplies held a quite different energy. Men who once trudged in silence now shared quiet attempts at sentences, smiling faintly when they managed to shape a phrase correctly. The lessons did not erase the gray monotony of camp life, but they softened it, adding a sense of shared purpose that stretched across the divide. The routine remained the same, yet it felt warmer, as if the simple act of learning had breathed a small, steady pulse of humanity into each passing hour. Among the many quiet exchanges in the camp, two stories gradually came to reflect the deeper shift taking place, one belonging to a German prisoner named Lucas, the other to a British guard named Alan. Lucas had been a carpenter before the war, a young man with steady hands and a habit of studying the grain of a piece of wood before ever lifting a tool. In the camp, he often volunteered for repair work, finding comfort in the familiar feel of timber beneath his fingers. Alan noticed this early on. He was older, a father of two, with a calm, measured way of speaking that came from years spent helping in his father's workshop back home. Though they stood on opposite sides of the conflict, the rhythm of manual work offered them common ground. One afternoon, while fixing a broken doorframe, Alan introduced Lucas to the English names of the tools they used. "Chisel," he said, placing the tool in Lucas's hand with a small nod. Lucas repeated it, his accent soft but earnest. Alan smiled and offered another word. Soon the two fell into a pattern of working and speaking, their shared craft becoming a language of its own. Lucas began to trust the moments of quiet guidance, and Alan, in turn, found a sense of purpose in helping someone rebuild more than wood. Their simple exchanges carried no grand intention, yet they anchored the growing understanding that even in a place shaped by war, two men could meet without walls between them, if only for the span of a word.
In the quiet hours between duties, when the camp settled into its familiar stillness, both prisoners and guards found themselves turning over the meaning of these small exchanges. The Germans wondered how it was possible that men they had been warned to fear could show such patience, such steady willingness to teach them skills that might help long after the war was over. Some wrestled with the uneasy truth that kindness could come from those they had once imagined as enemies, and that such gestures revealed a world far more complex than the one they had been taught to defend. Others simply felt a gentle gratitude, surprised by how much a single shared word could ease the heaviness of their days. The British guards, too, were not untouched by reflection. They stood watch in long stretches of silence, thinking about how these young men, so similar in age to their own brothers, cousins, or sons, had been swept into the same vast current of conflict. Teaching them English did not feel like aiding an opponent. It felt like offering a piece of stability to someone living in the same uncertainty. Many guards realized that the war's lines, drawn sharply on maps and in speeches, became softer when seen up close. In these moments of quiet thought,
Both sides began to sense that the lessons were shaping more than vocabulary. They were shaping the way each man saw the other, preparing the ground for the deeper shifts yet to come. As the months passed, a subtle change drifted through the camp, as if the air itself carried the promise of something drawing near. It began with letters, thin envelopes passed from hand to hand, their paper worn soft from travel. Some guards received word that fighting had slowed on
certain fronts. Others heard from relatives that towns once shadowed by fear now spoke cautiously of peace. The prisoners noticed a shift in posture long before anyone said a word. Guards who once moved with the rigid certainty of wartime now carried an undercurrent of distraction, their expressions softer, their gestures less guarded. Rumors spread quietly among the German men, carried in whispers across bunk beds and through the narrow aisles of the barracks. Some believed the war would end within weeks. Others, scarred by disappointment, held their breath and waited. Even so, the mood within the camp changed in ways that could be felt rather than explained. Work details seemed lighter somehow. Conversations lingered a little longer, and men who had once kept their eyes lowered now glanced upward as if expecting the horizon to shift. The thought of returning home brought both hope and unease, stirring memories of the lives they had left behind. For the prisoners, the unknown future felt close enough to touch, yet still wrapped in mist. And in that in-between space, a quiet anticipation settled, bittersweet and steady, marking the first gentle steps toward the end of their long captivity. When the day finally came for some of the men to leave, the camp felt unusually still, as if it understood the weight of what was about to unfold. The prisoners gathered in small groups near the gate, each man clutching a few belongings, a folded blanket, a carved trinket, a scrap of paper covered in English words they hoped not to forget. The guards stood nearby, their usual firmness softened by something quieter, something that lived beneath the surface of duty. There were no grand speeches, no formal salutes. Instead, there were small gestures that spoke with greater honesty. A nod held a moment longer, a brief clasp of hands, a murmured wish for safe travels home.
Alan sought out Lucas before he departed, finding him near a stack of crates where they had once practiced tool names. For a moment, neither man knew what to say. Finally, Alan offered a few simple words. "You'll be all right," spoken with a warmth that carried far more than their plain meaning. Lucas repeated them softly, as though memorizing their shape. Other guards exchanged quiet farewells with the men they had come to know through shared work and patience. Some offered a final correction on a mispronounced phrase, half in jest, half in affection. There was sadness in these partings, but it was gentle, threaded with gratitude rather than grief. As the prisoners stepped through the gate toward the uncertain world beyond, both sides felt the quiet ache of leaving behind something unexpectedly human, something grown in the unlikeliest of places. Years later, long after the fences had been taken down and the uniforms folded away, the memory of those small lessons continued to travel quietly through the lives of the men who had shared them. Some of the former prisoners returned to towns that felt unfamiliar, shaped by the scars of conflict and the slow work of rebuilding. Yet, in workshops, on farms, and in bustling railway yards, a few found themselves recalling the English words first spoken to them beside cold barrack walls. They used them cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, discovering doors that opened not through rank or victory, but through communication and willingness. Some, those words led to new jobs, For others, they simply became a reminder that the world was wider and kinder than the war had allowed them to believe. The guards, too, carried the memory forward. In quiet moments, they would think back to the young men they had once watched over, remembering how shared work and simple patience had softened the harsh lines drawn by conflict. They understood that the lessons had been more than language. They had been acts of humanity exchanged during a time that offered few. And in this understanding, both sides found a gentle reassurance. What had begun as small kindnesses had echoed far beyond the camp, shaping lives in ways none of them could have predicted. It was a reminder that even in the shadow of war, the smallest gestures can hold the power to outlast the noise of history.